There was a time when the name Kong Siahan echoed across every server, every dungeon, and every leaderboard in existence. A time when whispers of his power spread like wildfire through the halls of the world's greatest guilds. He wasn't just a player. He was the player. The one who stood at the absolute pinnacle of Etheron Online, the world's first fully immersive VR MMO. A game so revolutionary that it didn't just change the gaming industry, it changed reality itself. Because Etheron Online was never just a game. When the Dimensional Rift first tore open 10 years ago, no one understood what was happening. The skies cracked like shattered glass, and from those fractures poured creatures that should have only existed in fantasy, monsters of fire and shadow. Beasts with armor-plated hides and claws that could tear through reinforced steel. Dungeons materialized in the middle of cities, their dark entrances pulsing with energy that warped the very air around them. The world plunged into chaos overnight. Governments scrambled. Militaries failed. Conventional weapons could barely scratch the surface of these otherworldly threats. And then came Etheron Online. It wasn't entertainment anymore. It was humanity's lifeline. The game's system merged with reality, granting real people real power, stats, skills, classes, levels. Anyone who logged in could awaken abilities that let them fight back against the monsters pouring through the rifts. Hunters were born. Guilds were formed. A new hierarchy emerged where your rank wasn't determined by wealth or status, it was determined by how deep into the dungeons you could go and still come back alive. And at the very top of that hierarchy stood Kong Siahan. He was a solo player in a world that demanded teamwork. A swordsman whose blade moved faster than the system could calculate. His damage numbers broke visual displays. His reaction time made even the fastest assassin-class players look like they were moving through water. By the time the endgame content was released, the final raid dungeon, a nightmarish labyrinth called the Throne of Collapse, Siahan had already surpassed every known metric the system had ever recorded. But even the strongest player in the world couldn't survive betrayal from the people he trusted most. The Celestial Order. That was the name of his guild. 12 elite players, each one handpicked by Siahan himself. He had trained them. Fought beside them. Bled with them through dungeons that would have swallowed lesser teams whole. They were his comrades. His family. Or so he believed. The final raid was supposed to be their greatest triumph. The Throne of Collapse housed the Architect's Fragment, a world boss so powerful that the system itself classified it as an extinction-level threat. No guild had ever attempted it. No strategy existed for it. But Siahan had spent months preparing, mapping every attack pattern, every phase transition, every vulnerability the boss revealed across its 12 stages of combat. They entered as a team of 13. By stage 9, only Siahan was still fighting. Not because the others had fallen to the boss. No. They had fallen to something far worse, their own greed. Mid-battle, at the exact moment when the Architect's Fragment entered its vulnerable phase, every single member of the Celestial Order turned on Siahan simultaneously. Baek Ji-hun, his best friend, the guild's vice leader, the man Siahan had once pulled from the jaws of a collapsing A-rank dungeon, drove a poison-coated blade directly into his back. Nothing personal, Siahan, Ji-hun had whispered, his voice calm, almost gentle. But the world doesn't need a god. It needs heroes it can control. They stripped his inventory. Stole his legendary equipment. Drained his consumables. And then they left him there, bleeding, paralyzed, and alone, as the dungeon began its collapse sequence. The walls crumbled inward. The floor dissolved into void. And Kong Siahan, the greatest player who ever lived, fell into darkness. The world was told he died a hero's death. The Celestial Order emerged from the dungeon carrying the raid's completion rewards, their faces solemn, their words rehearsed. He sacrificed himself to weaken the boss, Ji-hun told the cameras, his eyes wet with manufactured grief. We finished what he started. His legacy lives on through us. Lies. Every single word. They became S-rank hunters overnight. The system rewarded them with titles, with power, with authority. The World Gate Authority, the global organization created to manage hunters and dungeon threats, was restructured under their influence. Ji-hun became its shadow leader. The other 11 members became its pillars. They controlled the rankings, the dungeon access, the distribution of resources. They built an empire on the grave of the men they murdered. And for 10 long years, that empire stood unchallenged. Because Kong Siahan was dead. Except he wasn't. When the dungeon collapsed and the void swallowed him whole, Siahan didn't vanish into nothingness. He fell into the space between, the gap between the game's deleted server architecture and the fabric of merged reality. A place that was never meant to exist. A place with no exit, no logout function, no rescue signal. Just endless darkness stretching in every direction, populated by monsters that had been purged from the game's code. Creatures deemed too powerful, too broken, too dangerous for any player to face. Deleted bosses. Scrapped raid content. Prototype enemies with no level caps and no mercy. This was the void. And it became his prison. Time moved differently here. A single day in reality stretched into months within the void. Months became years. Years became decades. And decades, for Siahan, became centuries. He lost count somewhere after the 300th year. The isolation alone should have broken him. The darkness should have consumed his mind. But Kang Siahan was not built to break. He fought. Every single day, he fought. Against monsters that had no right to exist. Against bosses that required entire raid teams but had to be faced alone. Against his own despair, which clawed at him during the quiet moments between battles, whispering that no one was coming, that no one remembered. That he had been erased from a world that had already moved on without him. He fought anyway. He completed quests that had been deleted before launch, hidden storylines buried in the game's abandoned code, each one rewarding skills and titles that no living player had ever seen. He discovered fighting techniques embedded in the void's geometry itself, combat arts that bent the rules of the system in ways the developers never intended. He killed bosses that regenerated endlessly, learning their patterns so thoroughly that his body moved before his mind could even process the threat. He didn't just survive the void. He mastered it. His stats climbed beyond anything the system's framework was designed to contain. Strength, agility, intelligence, endurance, mana capacity, every single parameter hit its maximum value, then kept climbing into numbers that had no official classification. His skill list grew so long that the system's interface couldn't render it without crashing. His title collection included designations from questlines that predated the game's public release, titles like Walker of Erased Paths, Conqueror of the Unborn Abyss, and The Last Variable. Each one carried passive bonuses so powerful they would have been classified as exploits in the live game. And then, one day, without warning, light. A crack appeared in the void. Not a dungeon portal. Not a monster spawn. A crack in reality itself, thin as a thread, pulsing with familiar energy. Siahan recognized it instantly. It was a system update. Someone, somewhere in the real world, had launched new content for Etheron. The game was rebooting. And the void, that forgotten, deleted space between worlds, was being overwritten. The crack widened. The void shuddered around him. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Kang Siahan saw color. He was pulled through like a thread through a needle, violently, instantly, without ceremony. The void spat him out and sealed itself behind him, as if it had never existed at all. And when his vision cleared, when the blinding white light faded and his senses adjusted to a world that felt almost offensively vivid after centuries of darkness, he was standing in a starting village. Green grass beneath his boots. A wooden signpost to his left reading, Beginner Zone, Ilaris Village. NPCs wandering lazily between market stalls. A gentle breeze carrying the scent of freshly rendered flowers. Around him, new players in basic leather armor swung wooden swords at training dummies, their damage numbers floating upward in single digits. Siahan looked down at his own hands. Young. Unwrinkled. Strong. His body had been restored to its prime, 22 years old, the same age he had been when he first logged into Etheron Online a decade ago. But his hands remembered centuries of combat. His muscles carried the memory of 10,000 impossible battles. And behind his calm, dark eyes burned a quiet fire that no starting village had ever seen. A translucent blue window flickered to life in front of him, the system's registration prompt, attempting to classify the newly detected player. Scanning player data, the window shuddered. Analyzing stats. Analyzing skills. Analyzing titles, the text began to stutter, characters scrambling and rearranging themselves as if the system was choking on information it couldn't digest. Warning, data volume exceeds system capacity, attempting classification. Failed, attempting rank assignment. Failed, attempting emergency calibration, the window cracked, literally cracked, like glass breaking inside a digital display. And then, in bright crimson text that pulsed with an almost angry intensity, a single message burned itself across his interface. Error, entity exceeds all parameters. Siahan stared at the message for a long, quiet moment. Around him, beginner players laughed and chatted, completely unaware that the most dangerous entity their world had ever produced was standing among them in a linen shirt and starter boots. He closed the error window with a slow flick of his hand. And for the first time in centuries, the faintest ghost of a smile crossed his lips. "So," he murmured, his voice hoarse from ages of disuse, rough and low like gravel dragged across stone. "They think they cleared the game." His eyes drifted toward the distant skyline, where the towering headquarters of the World Gate Authority gleamed like a silver monolith against the horizon, a monument built on stolen glory and buried truth. "Let's see how their little empire handles a dead man walking." The wind shifted. The system flickered again, as if afraid. And somewhere, in a penthouse office overlooking Seoul, Baek Ji-hoon felt a chill crawl down his spine, a sensation he hadn't experienced in 10 years. He paused mid-signature, pen hovering over a classified document, and glanced toward the window. Nothing there. Just the city. Just the sky. He shook it off and returned to his work. He shouldn't have. Because the forgotten hero had just logged back in. And this time, there was no guild to betray him. No dungeon to trap him. No void to contain him. There was only a man with maxed out stats, an unbreakable will, and a very, very long memory. And the world was about to remember his name. Kang Se-han walked slowly through the cobblestone streets of Ilaris village, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he simply observed. Not for threats. Not for attack patterns. Not for the telltale shimmer of a monster preparing to phase into existence from a deleted code fragment. He observed people. Living, breathing, laughing people who moved through the village with the casual ease of those who had never spent centuries alone in infinite darkness. Players in mismatched starter gear haggled with NPC shopkeepers over basic health potions. A group of teenagers compared their freshly assigned class titles with wide, excited grins. A street vendor, an actual human vendor, not a system-generated one, sold grilled skewers near the village fountain. His cart decorated with a hand-painted sign that read, "Real food for real hunters." Se-han stopped at that sign. Real food. Real hunters. The line between the game and reality hadn't just blurred, it had been completely erased. He bought a skewer with the handful of starter coins the system had automatically deposited into his glitched inventory. The vendor gave him a strange look, probably because Se-han stared at the food for a full 10 seconds before taking a bite, as though he had forgotten what eating felt like. The taste hit him like a wave. Warm. Savory. Utterly ordinary. And yet his eyes stung slightly, because ordinary was something he hadn't experienced in centuries. He swallowed. Blinked. And kept walking. Over the next several hours, Se-han moved through the starter zones with the quiet precision of a ghost. He suppressed his stats so aggressively that the system could barely register his presence, a technique he had developed in the void. Where certain deleted monsters could sense power levels and would become exponentially more dangerous if they detected strength above a certain threshold. To any observer, he looked like what he appeared to be, a fresh-faced 22-year-old in linen clothes and leather boots. Wandering through beginner territory with the slightly lost expression of someone who had just created their character. But behind that carefully constructed mask, his mind was operating at full capacity, absorbing every detail of this new world and cataloging it with ruthless efficiency. And what he found disturbed him. Etheron, Reawakening wasn't a game with real-world elements anymore. It was reality with game elements woven into its very foundation. The dimensional rifts that had first appeared 10 years ago had continued to expand and evolve, creating what the locals called layered zones, dungeon territories that existed on top of real geography like translucent overlays. Seoul had 14 active layers. Tokyo had 11. New York had 19. Every major city on Earth had been restructured around these zones, with residential areas pushed to the margins and dungeon territories occupying the most valuable real estate. And controlling access to those territories, controlling who could enter, who could hunt, who could profit, was the World Gate Authority. Se-han found a public information terminal near the village's eastern gate and scrolled through its database with growing unease. The World Gate Authority had been established 8 years ago as a global peacekeeping organization designed to regulate hunter activity and manage dungeon threats. Its founding members were listed prominently on the terminal's welcome screen, their portraits displayed with the kind of reverent framing usually reserved for statues of war heroes. He recognized every single face. Baek Ji-hoon, chairman of the World Gate Authority. Former vice leader of the Celestial Order. The man who had driven a poisoned blade into Se-han's spine while whispering an apology he didn't mean. Han Myri, director of intelligence. The guild's former scout, whose detection skills Se-han had personally helped her level in dozens of dungeon raids. Park Do-gun, commander of the enforcement division. The guild's tank. A man built like a fortress, whose shield Se-han had enchanted with a rare skill scroll he'd earned soloing a hidden boss, a shield Dogun had used to block Siahan's escape route during the betrayal. All 12 of them. Every single member of the Celestial Order held a position of power within the authority. They hadn't just survived the last decade, they had conquered it. They had taken the rewards from the incomplete final raid, used those stolen powers to establish themselves as the world's strongest hunters. And then systematically built an organization that gave them control over every dungeon, every ranking, every resource that mattered. The ranking system itself was their masterpiece of control. Every hunter on Earth was classified from F rank to S rank based on their measured stats and dungeon clear records. But the measurement process was administered exclusively by the authority. The promotion criteria were set by the authority. The dungeon access permissions were granted by the authority. If you wanted to advance, you needed their approval. If you wanted to hunt in anything above a C rank zone, you needed their license. If you questioned their decisions, you found your rank mysteriously frozen, your dungeon permits revoked, and your reputation quietly destroyed through channels you couldn't trace. It wasn't a ranking system. It was a leash. Siahan closed the terminal and stood motionless for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes unreadable. They hadn't just betrayed him. They had enslaved an entire world using the power they stole from his back. Every hunter who struggled under their system. Every player who was denied advancement because they didn't bow to the right people, all of it traced back to that single moment in the throne of collapse when 12 people decided that one man's trust was worth less than unlimited power. He exhaled slowly through his nose. Centuries of discipline kept his expression neutral, but beneath the surface, something old and heavy shifted inside his chest. Not rage. Not yet. Something colder. Something more patient. He kept moving. The further he traveled from Alaris village, the more the reality of this new world revealed itself. He passed through E-rank dungeon zones where fresh hunters, most of them teenagers who had just awakened their system connections, fought goblin-type creatures with clumsy desperation and mismatched gear. He watched a D-rank party struggle for 40 minutes against a mid-level stone golem that Siahan could have reduced to gravel by flexing his fingers. He saw the fear in their eyes. The exhaustion. The knowledge that one mistake meant death, real death, not a respawn screen, because in this merged reality, dying in a dungeon meant dying permanently. And yet they fought. Because fighting was the only path upward. Because the system rewarded dungeon clears with stats, with skills, with the chance to climb the rankings and earn a better life. And because the World Gate Authority had structured society so that non-hunters, civilians who couldn't or wouldn't fight, were pushed to the outer margins. Living in overcrowded safe zones with limited resources while the prime territories were reserved for ranked hunters and authority-affiliated guilds. The strong thrived. The weak survived. And the people at the top made sure the gap between them never closed. It was during his quiet observation of a low-ranked dungeon entrance that Siahan first noticed the party. There were 4 of them. 3 boys and a girl, none older than 19 or 20, all wearing gear that was barely functional, cracked leather armor, blunted swords. A staff held together with what appeared to be electrical tape. Their system windows displayed F-rank classifications, the lowest possible tier. Which meant they were either newly awakened or had been stuck at the bottom of the ranking system for long enough that their equipment had degraded past the point of reliable use. The girl was clearly the leader. She stood at the front of the group, a short sword in one hand and a battered shield in the other, her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and her eyes burning with the kind of fierce, stubborn determination that Siahan recognized instantly, because he had once worn that exact same expression, a lifetime ago, before the world taught him what determination actually cost. Her name, he would later learn, was Yuna. We go in, we clear the first 3 rooms, we grab whatever drops we can, and we get out before the respawn timer resets, she was saying to her party. Her voice steady despite the visible tension in her shoulders. No heroics. No detours. We cannot afford healing potions if someone gets hurt, so don't get hurt. One of the boys, a lanky kid with an archer class and exactly 4 arrows in his quiver, raised his hand nervously. Yuna, the guild notice said this dungeon's been showing instability readings. Maybe we should what? Wait. She turned on him, not with anger but with the raw frustration of someone who had been waiting too long already. We've been F-rank for 8 months, Tasik. 8 months. If we don't log clears, we don't rank up. If we don't rank up, we don't get access to better zones. If we don't get access to better zones, we stay exactly where we are, scraping by in beginner dungeons while the big guilds eat everything above us. She paused, her grip tightening on her shield. I didn't awaken just to rot at the bottom. They entered the dungeon. Siahan followed at a distance, curious despite himself. He told himself it was reconnaissance, that he needed to understand how the current dungeon system functioned in practice, not just in theory. But something about the girl's voice, the defiance in it. The refusal to accept a ceiling placed above her by people who had never earned the right to place it, it pulled at something in him that he thought the void had scoured away long ago. The dungeon was a standard E-rank layout. Stone corridors, dim lighting, low-level undead enemies that shambled forward with predictable attack patterns. Yuna's party moved through the first 2 rooms with the efficiency of a team that had run this exact dungeon dozens of times before. Their gear was terrible, their stats were barely adequate, but their coordination was surprisingly tight. Yuna called out attack patterns before the monsters even completed their wind-up animations. The archer, Tasik, placed his limited arrows with careful precision. The other 2, a swordsman and a mage whose mana pool was laughably small, filled their roles without complaint. They were good. Underpowered, under-equipped, and underestimated, but good. And then the dungeon broke. It started with a sound, a deep, resonant crack that vibrated through the stone walls like the dungeon itself was splitting apart from the inside. The ambient lighting shifted from dim yellow to a sickly, pulsing red. The system interface flickered wildly, and a warning message appeared in front of every player within a 3-kilometer radius. Dungeon break detected, E-rank zone 7, anomaly classification, B-rank entity spawning in restricted zone, warning. This event should not be possible within current system parameters, all nearby players are advised to evacuate immediately. The corridor ahead of Yuna's party didn't just change, it ruptured. The walls peeled apart like torn flesh, revealing a massive chamber that hadn't existed seconds before. And from the darkness of that chamber stepped something that made every member of the party freeze in primal, bone-deep terror. It was a Lich Sovereign. A B-rank undead boss with a skeletal frame wrapped in tattered royal robes, its hollow eye sockets burning with pale blue hellfire. It carried a staff of blackened bone that radiated cold so intense that frost formed on the dungeon walls in expanding fractals. And the air temperature dropped so sharply that Yuna could see her own breath crystallizing in front of her face. This creature was designed to be fought by a full party of B-rank hunters minimum, 20 players with optimized gear, coordinated skills, and months of strategic preparation. It had no business being here. Not in an E-rank dungeon. Not in a beginner zone. The system itself seemed to agree, because the anomaly warning was still flashing in angry red, as if the game's own architecture was screaming that something had gone terribly wrong. Run, Yuna whispered. Run. Run. They ran. But the Lich Sovereign was faster. It raised its staff and unleashed a wave of necrotic energy that swept through the corridor like a tidal wave of frozen death. Tasik was hit first, the blast caught his left side and sent him tumbling into the wall, his health bar plummeting from full to a sliver in less than a second. The swordsman tried to shield the mage and took the secondary shockwave directly, his armor cracking apart as he collapsed to his knees, barely conscious. Yuna threw herself in front of the next attack, shield raised, teeth clenched, every fiber of her being screaming at her that this was suicide. That she couldn't block a B-rank attack with an F-rank shield, that the math simply didn't work. She blocked it anyway. The impact shattered her shield instantly and hurled her backward, her body slamming into the stone floor with enough force to crack it. Her health bar dropped to 8%. Her vision blurred. Her system interface was flashing critical warnings that she could barely read through the haze of pain. The Lich Sovereign stepped forward, its burning eyes locked on her, its staff rising for the killing blow. Yuna looked up at it through blood-streaked vision, and in that moment, she thought about her brother. About his smile. About the way he had once told her that being strong wasn't about power, it was about standing up even when standing was impossible. She tried to stand. Her legs wouldn't respond. The staff came down. And then there was a sound, or rather, the absence of sound. A compression of air so sudden and so violent that it created a vacuum, a pocket of absolute silence that lasted exactly one heartbeat. In that heartbeat, a hand appeared between Yuna and the descending staff. A bare hand, without armor, without weapons, without any visible enchantment. Just a human hand attached to a young man in a linen shirt who had seemingly materialized from nowhere. Siahan caught the staff mid-swing. The Lich Sovereign's hellfire eyes flickered, an emotion that might have been confusion, if undead abominations were capable of such things. It tried to pull its weapon free. It couldn't. The staff, a B-rank legendary weapon channeling enough necrotic energy to level a city block, was locked in place by 5 human fingers that didn't even bother to tighten their grip. Siahan looked at the creature with an expression of mild inconvenience, the way a person might look at an insect that had landed on their arm during breakfast. "You don't belong here," he said quietly. Not to the Lich Sovereign as a threat, but as a clinical observation, a statement of systemic fact. This creature was a fracture. A fragment of something larger that had slipped through a crack in the game's architecture. He could feel it now, the same corrupted energy signature he had encountered in the deepest layers of the void. The architect's residue. Leaking into the new system like poison through a cracked vessel. His former guildmates hadn't just failed to complete the final raid. They had left the door open. And now, a decade later, the things behind that door were starting to push through. But that was a problem for later. Right now, there was a dying girl on the floor behind him and a B-rank abomination that needed to stop existing. So Siahan stopped it. He released the staff and struck the Lich Sovereign once, a single, open-palmed blow to the center of its ribcage. There was no dramatic wind-up. No glowing skill animation. No chanted ability name. Just a movement so fast that reality itself seemed to hiccup, as if the laws of physics needed a moment to catch up with what had just happened. The Lich Sovereign didn't shatter. It didn't explode. It simply ceased. Every molecule of its existence was dispersed so completely and so instantly that there was nothing left to fall, no bones, no robes, no staff, no residual energy. The frozen air warmed immediately. The red lighting returned to normal. The ruptured chamber walls sealed themselves as if they had never opened. The entire encounter, from the moment Siahan stepped into the moment the boss ceased to exist, lasted exactly 0.3 of a second. And then the system lost its mind. B-rank anomaly cleared, clear time, 0.3 seconds, player identification, unknown, alert. This clear record exceeds all historical data, server-wide notification activated, across every city on Earth, across every dungeon zone and hunter outpost and authority command center. The same message blazed across every connected system interface in bold, unmissable text. Unknown player has cleared a B-rank anomaly in 0.3 seconds, all guilds notified. In Seoul, mid-rank hunters stopped mid-dungeon and stared at their interfaces in disbelief. In Tokyo, an S-rank guild leader spat out his coffee. In New York, the authorities' North American branch erupted into frantic activity as analysts scrambled to trace the alert's origin. And in the penthouse office of the World Gate Authority Central Headquarters, Han Myri, Director of Intelligence, former scout of the Celestial Order, stared at the notification with pupils that had contracted to pinpoints. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her encrypted communication device. Chairman Ji-hun, she said, her voice carefully controlled but unable to fully mask the tremor beneath it. We have a situation. A B-rank anomaly was cleared in a beginner zone. In 0.3 seconds. By an unregistered player. Silence on the other end. Then, very quietly, that's not possible. No, Myri agreed. It's not. Which is why I'm calling you. Another silence. Longer this time. And when Ji-hun spoke again, his voice had changed, the polished confidence of a chairman replaced by something rawer, something older, something that sounded uncomfortably like fear. Find them. Use everything we have. And Myri, a pause. Check the old files. The sealed ones. The ones from the Throne of Collapse. The line went dead. Back in the dungeon, Siahan was already turning to leave, his face expressionless, his posture deliberately casual, as though he had just swatted a fly rather than erased a B-rank boss from existence. He needed to disappear before the alert drew attention. He needed to stay invisible until he understood the full scope of what his former guild had built and, more importantly, what was leaking through the cracks they had left in the system. But a voice stopped him. Wait. He turned. Yuna was on her knees, one arm clutching her cracked ribs, blood trickling from a cut above her left eyebrow. Her health bar was still critical. Her party members were unconscious behind her. She should have been focused on survival, on healing, on processing the fact that she had nearly died. Instead, she was staring at him with eyes that held no fear. Only a burning, desperate clarity. Who are you? She asked. Siahan looked at her for a long moment. He saw the broken shield beside her. The way she had placed herself between the Lich Sovereign and her fallen teammates, even though she knew, she had to have known, that she couldn't survive the next hit. He saw a girl who had chosen to die standing rather than live running. And something behind his ribs shifted again. That same old, heavy thing. Not rage. Not yet. Something warmer. Something he had thought the void had taken from him forever. Nobody, he said. Just a low-level player passing through. He turned and walked away before she could respond, vanishing into the dungeon's exit corridor with steps that made no sound. Within seconds, he was gone, swallowed by the crowd of panicking hunters who were flooding toward the dungeon break site, drawn by the system alert like moths to flame. Yuna stayed on her knees for a long time, staring at the empty corridor where the stranger had stood. Her hands were shaking. Her body was screaming at her to lie down, to rest, to accept the healing potions that arriving medic-class hunters were already pressing into her trembling fingers. But her mind was fixed on one thing. That man had killed a B-rank boss with his bare hand. In an instant. Without a skill animation. Without even trying. And his eyes, calm, ancient, impossibly tired, those weren't the eyes of a low-level player passing through. "I'll find you," she whispered to the empty air. She meant it with every fractured rib in her body. And miles away, standing on a rooftop overlooking the city's central dungeon district, Siahan gazed down at the sprawling territory of the World Gate Authority, at the towers, the checkpoints. The ranked zones that carved humanity into tiers of usefulness. He thought about the Lich Sovereign. About the Architect's fractured energy leaking through the cracks. About 12 people who had traded his life for an empire. The dungeons were breaking. The system was destabilizing. And the people responsible were too busy protecting their power to notice that the foundation beneath them was rotting from the inside. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, the error message was still there, hovering faintly at the edge of his vision like a scar the system couldn't heal. "Error, entity exceeds all parameters." "Yeah," he murmured. "I know." The wind carried his words away over a city built on lies, toward a reckoning that had been 10 years, and several centuries, in the making. It started with a whisper. Not a literal one, but the kind of whisper that spreads through systems and networks and encrypted guild channels like smoke under a door. A whisper made of data. Of impossible numbers. Of dungeon clear records that shouldn't exist, filed by a player who, according to every database in the world, didn't exist either. 3 days after the B-rank anomaly alert shook every hunter organization on the planet. An A-rank dungeon in Busan's industrial layered zone, a territory exclusively licensed to the Celestial Order Southern Division, was cleared overnight. No party registered at the gate. No entry log recorded. No exit timestamp filed. The dungeon simply reset. Its monsters were gone. Its boss was gone. Its loot chambers were empty. And in the deepest room, where the final boss had resided for 3 years unchallenged because the Celestial Order had deemed it too resource-intensive to clear, while quietly farming its surrounding floors for profit. There was nothing left but a scorch mark on the stone floor and a single item hovering in midair. Rotating slowly in a column of faint, violet light. A void relic. The authorities' analysts had never seen anything like it. The item defied classification. Its material composition didn't match any known crafting resource in Etheron, Reawakening's database. Its system tag was written in a code language that predated the game's current architecture, legacy code from the original Etheron Online. The version that had been supposedly decommissioned and overwritten during the Reawakening update. When a brave technician finally interfaced with the relic using a standard analysis tool, the tool didn't just malfunction, it evolved. Its scanning capabilities expanded tenfold, revealing layers of dungeon data that had been previously invisible, as if someone had pulled back a curtain that no one knew existed. Hidden rooms appeared on dungeon maps that had been considered fully explored. Sealed quest markers activated in zones that the authority had classified as cleared and closed. And in every single case, the newly revealed content pointed toward one thing, the original endgame. The Throne of Collapse. The final raid that the Celestial Order claimed to have completed 10 years ago. Except the system was now saying, in no uncertain terms, that it hadn't been completed at all. And Kong Siahan, standing on a rain-slicked rooftop in Incheon, watching the distant glow of another dungeon entrance he planned to hit before dawn, knew exactly why. Because he had been there. He had watched them abandon the raid at its most critical moment. He had felt the dungeon collapse around him while they fled with partial rewards, choosing stolen power over a completed mission. The Architect's fragment, the final boss of the Throne of Collapse, hadn't been defeated, it had been left wounded and festering in the space between servers. Its corrupted essence slowly bleeding into every system update, every dungeon spawn, every rift that opened on Earth's surface. The B-rank Lich Sovereign that had nearly killed Yuna's party in a beginner zone wasn't a random glitch. It was a symptom. A fragment of the Architect's broken power pushing through the cracks that the Celestial Order's incomplete raid had torn in the system's architecture. The dungeons weren't just malfunctioning. They were rotting from the inside. And every day the Celestial Order spent protecting their empire instead of addressing the root cause, the rot spread deeper. So Siahan did what he had always done best. He went to work. Over the next 2 weeks, he moved through the world's dungeon network like a surgical instrument, precise, silent, and utterly devastating. He targeted territories that the Celestial Order had monopolized, choosing dungeons that their affiliated guilds had been farming for years without ever fully clearing. Dungeons kept deliberately incomplete because an uncleared dungeon was a renewable resource, an endless source of monster drops and experience points that the authority could tax and regulate. He cleared them all. One by one. Night after night. A-rank dungeons in Seoul. A-rank dungeons in Osaka. An S-rank dungeon in Shanghai that 3 of the world's top guilds had spent 4 years developing a clearing strategy for. Siahan walked in alone at 2 a.m. and walked out at 2:47 a.m. leaving behind an empty dungeon, a stunned gate security team, and another void relic hovering in the boss chamber like a glowing accusation. Each relic he left behind did the same thing. It interfaced with the local system architecture and began restoring data that had been suppressed, hidden, or deliberately deleted. Sealed quest lines reactivated. Hidden dungeon layers became visible. And most importantly, fragments of the original Etheron Online's endgame narrative, the story content that explained what the architect truly was and why the final raid existed, began surfacing in the form of system messages that appeared on the interfaces of nearby players. Messages like, restored data, the Throne of Collapse was designed as a cooperative endgame event. Upon completion, its rewards were to be distributed equally among all active players worldwide. Restored data, the raid was abandoned at Phase 9 of 12. Partial rewards were extracted by a party of 12 players. Full completion was never achieved. Restored data, the entity known as the Architect, remains active. Current system instability is a direct result of incomplete raid resolution. These messages didn't just appear on private interfaces. They appeared on public terminals. On guild hall displays. On the massive holographic billboards that the World Gate Authority used to broadcast rankings and announcements in every major city. And because the data was being restored by the system itself, not hacked, not fabricated, but genuinely recovered from the game's original architecture, the Authority couldn't dismiss it as misinformation without admitting that their own system was contradicting their official history. The cracks in the hero's throne were beginning to show. And people were starting to notice. Hunter forums exploded with speculation. Independent analysts began cross-referencing the restored data with the Celestial Order's official account of the final raid and finding inconsistencies that couldn't be explained away. A prominent Hunter journalist in Seoul published an article titled, "Did the Celestial Order Actually Clear the Endgame?" that garnered 40 million views in 12 hours before the authorities' legal division had it forcibly removed, a move that only amplified the suspicion. But Siahan wasn't paying attention to public opinion. He was already 3 steps ahead, focused on something far more personal. He was in a C-rank dungeon in Taejun when she found him. He had chosen this particular dungeon not because it posed any challenge. A C-rank dungeon to him was like a puddle to an ocean, but because its system architecture contained a sealed data node that he suspected would yield another void relic if properly activated. He was methodically working through the dungeon's lower floors, dispatching monsters with minimal effort while his real attention was focused on reading the flow of corrupted code that threaded through the dungeon's walls like veins of infection. When he heard footsteps behind him. Not monster footsteps. Human footsteps. Determined, slightly uneven, the gait of someone who was pushing through exhaustion on pure willpower. He didn't turn around. "You've been following me for 6 days," he said, his voice echoing through the stone corridor. Silence. Then, from the shadows behind him, Yuna stepped into the dim light of the dungeon's phosphorescent walls. She looked different from the last time he'd seen her, still wearing subpar gear, still carrying a replacement shield that was barely better than the one the Lich Sovereign had shattered. But her eyes had changed. The desperate terror of someone facing death had been replaced by something harder. Something focused. Something that burned. 7 days, actually, she corrected. "You missed the first one because I was better at hiding than you expected." He almost smiled. Almost. "How did you track me?" Yuna reached into her pack and pulled out a small, jagged crystal that pulsed with faint violet light. "After you killed that Lich Sovereign, this appeared where it died. Everyone else was too panicked to notice. I picked it up before the authorities' cleanup team arrived." She held it up. "It reacts when you're nearby. Gets brighter the closer I get. Took me 3 days to figure out the pattern of which dungeons you were hitting, and 4 more to actually catch up. A void relic fragment. Residual energy from the boss he'd obliterated, crystallized into a tracking beacon attuned to his unique signature. He should have been more careful. The void's energy was part of him now. He left traces everywhere he went, invisible to normal players but apparently not to someone carrying a piece of that same energy. "Clever," he said. And meant it. "I'm not here to be clever," Yuna replied, and her voice dropped the faint veneer of bravado, revealing the raw steel underneath. "I'm here because you're the strongest person I've ever seen, and I need you to train me." "No. The word was immediate. Flat. Final. Yuna didn't flinch. She had clearly expected this answer and had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, by refusing to accept it. My brother's name was Jin Yuna, she said. He was a B-rank hunter. One of the best in Taejun's Eastern Division. 3 years ago, he was promoted to the Celestial Order's inner circle, not the public guild, the real one. The one that runs the authority from behind closed doors. Her voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly at her sides. He lasted 4 months. Then he started asking questions. About the final raid. About the original endgame. About why certain dungeon data was being classified and sealed by the authority instead of shared with the hunter community. She paused. Her jaw tightened. They told me he died in a dungeon accident. A routine clear gone wrong. Unlucky monster spawn. Her eyes met Siahan's, and the fire in them was no longer warm, it was white-hot, the kind of heat that melts steel. But I saw the autopsy report. My brother's injuries weren't from monsters. They were from hunter-grade weapons. Skills that only high-ranked guild members would have access to. He wasn't killed by a dungeon. She took a breath. He was killed by the people he trusted. Because he found out something they didn't want anyone to know. The silence that followed was heavy enough to bend light. Siahan stood motionless, his back still partially turned to her. But his eyes had shifted, no longer distant and guarded but focused on her with an intensity that made the air between them feel like it was vibrating. He saw her clearly now. Not just a fierce girl with inadequate gear and too much courage. He saw a reflection. A mirror held up to a version of himself that had existed a lifetime ago, young, burning, righteous, standing at the edge of an abyss and refusing to look away. He had been that person once. Before the void. Before centuries of isolation stripped away everything that wasn't essential. He had been someone who believed that trust was strength, that loyalty was armor, that the people you fought beside would never turn their blades on you. That person had been wrong. And the cost of being wrong had been everything. But looking at Yuna, at the way she stood her ground in a C-rank dungeon that could kill her 6 times over. Demanding training from a man she'd watched erase a B-rank boss with his bare hand, he couldn't deny that something about her refusal to break reminded him of why he had started fighting in the first place. Not for power. Not for rank. Not for the system. For the people who deserved better than what the powerful were willing to give them. The things I could teach you, he said slowly, don't exist in the current system. They're not skills you can learn through normal progression. They come from a place that was never meant to be accessed, techniques that bend the rules of how Etheron's architecture processes combat data. If you learn them, the system won't know how to classify you. Your growth will become invisible to normal measurement tools. The authority won't be able to rank you, and anything they can't rank, they consider a threat. He turned fully to face her. You'll become an anomaly. Like me. And in this world, anomalies don't get celebrated. They get hunted. Yuna's response was to drop her shield on the ground, draw her short sword, and settle into a fighting stance so determined that it bordered on reckless. Then teach me how to fight the hunters. Something shifted behind Siahan's eyes. Something ancient and tired and impossibly heavy, and for just a moment, almost gentle. Your stance is wrong, he said quietly. Widen your feet. Lower your center. And stop gripping the sword like you're trying to strangle it. A blade isn't a weapon you force. It's a conversation you lead. Yuna adjusted. It was imperfect, clumsy, the muscle memory of an F-rank fighter trying to adopt a posture designed for a completely different combat philosophy. But she adjusted without hesitation. Without complaint. Without asking why. And so, in the dim glow of a dungeon that neither of them had any business being in together, the training began. What Siahan taught her over the following days wasn't skill acquisition in the traditional sense. In Etheron, reawakening, skills were learned through system-granted skill books, quest rewards, or reaching specific stat thresholds that triggered automatic unlocks. The process was structured, predictable, and entirely controlled by the authority's regulated progression framework. What Siahan offered was something else entirely. In the void, where deleted content and abandoned code existed in a state of perpetual decay and regeneration, the normal rules of skill acquisition didn't apply. Techniques weren't learned, they were discovered, reverse-engineered from the raw logic of the system's foundational code. Siahan had spent centuries dissecting the way Etheron processed combat, how damage calculations worked at the deepest level, how the system determined hit detection. How skill animations were actually just visual representations of underlying mathematical operations. And once you understood the math, you could change the equation. He called them void techniques, not because they were dark or forbidden in any moral sense, but because they existed in the space between the system's recognized operations. A void technique didn't trigger a skill animation because the system didn't recognize it as a skill. It didn't consume mana in the traditional sense because it bypassed the mana calculation protocol entirely, drawing energy directly from the user's physical stamina and willpower instead. And because the system couldn't classify these techniques, it couldn't defend against them, which meant that defensive skills, damage reduction buffs, and even certain types of armor enchantments simply didn't activate when a void technique was used against them. It was, in essence, a way of fighting that the game's rules couldn't see. Teaching it to Yuna was like teaching someone to breathe underwater, theoretically impossible, practically agonizing, and absolutely terrifying for the student. She spent the first 2 days failing so completely that her body accumulated system error messages like bruises. Her interface flickering with confused warnings every time she attempted a technique that the system couldn't process. But she didn't stop. She didn't complain. She fell, and she stood up. She failed, and she tried again. She pushed her body past limits that the system told her were absolute, and when the system flashed red warnings that she was exceeding her stat thresholds, she ignored them with the same stubborn defiance she had shown when she blocked a B-rank attack with an F-rank shield. By the end of the first week, she could execute a basic void strike, a simple, unadorned attack that carried no visual effect, no system tag, and no damage number display, but hit with roughly 3 times the force her stats should have allowed. The first time she successfully landed one on a training dummy, the dummy didn't just break. It disintegrated. She stared at the empty space where it had been. Then she looked down at her fist. Then she looked at Siahan, who was leaning against the dungeon wall with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. That felt different, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Like the system wasn't watching. It wasn't, Siahan confirmed. And that's the point. Meanwhile, 600 kilometers away, in the obsidian glass tower that served as the World Gate Authority's global headquarters in Central Seoul, the mood was very different. Baek Ji-hun stood in the center of the authority's war room, a circular chamber lined with holographic displays showing real-time data from every active dungeon zone on the planet. Around him sat the 11 other members of the Celestial Order's inner circle, each one occupying a chair that represented their division of power within the organization. Intelligence. Enforcement. Resource management. Territorial control. Public relations. Medical. Technology. Each chair held a person who had been in that dungeon 10 years ago. Each person in those chairs had helped drive a blade into Kang Sihan's back. And right now, every single one of them was afraid. Han Myri's intelligence report was displayed on the central holographic projector, a 3-dimensional map of the world's dungeon network with bright red markers indicating every anonymous dungeon clear that had occurred in the past 2 weeks. There were 47 markers. 47 dungeons cleared by an unregistered player with no recorded entry, no party affiliation. And clear times that made the world's fastest S-rank hunters look like they were moving through molasses. But it wasn't the clear times that had drained the color from Ji-hun's face. It was the analysis that Myri had attached to the bottom of her report, a comparative movement study that overlaid the anonymous player's dungeon approach patterns. Combat positioning data extracted from environmental damage analysis, and estimated strike trajectories against a decade-old database entry that should have been permanently sealed. The match was 97.8%. It's him, Myri said, and for all her training in emotional control, her voice carried the faintest tremor. The movement patterns, the approach vectors. The way the dungeons are cleared from the bottom up with the boss targeted last, it's identical to Siahan's combat methodology from the original Etheron Online. No one else fought like that. No one else even could. Park Do-gun, commander of enforcement, the man whose stolen shield had blocked Siahan's escape, slammed his fist on the table. That's impossible. He's dead. The dungeon collapsed. The server was deleted. There is no scenario in which, the void relics, another voice interrupted. Choi Sarah, director of technology, spoke with the clinical detachment of someone who had spent the last 72 hours dissecting impossible data without sleep. Every dungeon he clears generates an item composed of legacy code from the original server. Code that shouldn't exist anymore. Code that can only be generated by an entity that was present on the original server at the time of its deletion and somehow survived the transition. She paused, letting that impossibility settle over the room like a funeral shroud. He didn't die in the collapse. He was inside the server when it was deleted. And now the reawakening update has brought him back. Silence. The kind of silence that fills a room when 12 people simultaneously realize that the ghost they've been running from for a decade has just knocked on the front door. Ji-hun hadn't spoken since the briefing began. He stood at the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid, his face a mask of composed authority that he had spent 10 years perfecting. To his subordinates, the thousands of authority employees who saw him on broadcasts and press conferences, he was the image of unshakable leadership. The man who had cleared the endgame. The hero who had saved the world. But the 11 people in this room knew the truth. And right now, looking at the red markers on the holographic map, 47 marks of a dead man's return. Each one a scalpel cutting deeper into the foundation of everything they had built. Ji-hun's mask was showing cracks of its own. The void relics are the real problem, he said finally, his voice low and controlled but carrying an undercurrent that the others recognized immediately. Not anger. Fear. Every relic he drops restores sealed system data. Data about the final raid. About what actually happened in the Throne of Collapse. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across each face in the room. If enough of that data is restored, the system itself will contradict our official record. And if the public learns that we didn't complete the raid, that we deliberately left it incomplete to hoard the power distribution, then everything we've built, every rank we hold, every territory we control, becomes illegitimate overnight. He let that sink in. We don't just lose our positions. We lose our power. The system will reclassify us based on our actual achievements, not the ones we fabricated. And without the partial raid rewards propping up our stats. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew exactly what their real stats were, the stats they'd had before they stole an endgame's worth of power from him and they'd left to die. Without that stolen power, most of them would barely qualify as A rank. So we find him and we kill him, Do-gun growled. Again. Properly this time. You don't understand, Ji-hun said, and for the first time, his composure cracked, just slightly. Just enough for the others to see the thing that had been eating him alive since Myri's first report. If his movement patterns match his old data at 97%, that means his fundamental combat style hasn't changed. But his clear times have. In the original game, Siahan's fastest A-rank dungeon clear was 11 minutes. These dungeons are being cleared in under an hour. Some in minutes. He paused. He's not the same player he was 10 years ago. He's been somewhere, doing something that has made him exponentially stronger. And we have no data on what that something is. The room absorbed this in heavy silence. Ji-hun closed his eyes. When he opened them, the fear was still there, but it had been wrapped in something harder. Something desperate. Activate protocol erasure. The reaction was immediate. Several members visibly flinched. Choi Sarah's clinical composure fractured, her eyes widening. Even Do-gun, who had just advocated for killing Siahan directly, looked uncertain. Chairman, Myri said carefully, protocol erasure has never been tested on a live target. It was designed as a theoretical failsafe, a last resort. If it malfunctions, it won't malfunction, Ji-hun cut her off. I built it specifically for this scenario. Specifically for him. He turned to face the central display, where the red markers of Siahan's dungeon clears glowed like warning lights in the dark. We embedded it in the system's core code during the reawakening update. It's a targeted deletion protocol. It identifies a specific player's data signature and erases it from the system entirely. Not just their character. Their stats, their skills, their connection to the game's architecture. Everything. It's as if they never existed. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, but every person in the room heard it with perfect, terrible clarity. I built it because I always knew there was a chance he'd come back. Even when everyone told me it was impossible. Even when I told myself it was impossible. His hands, still clasped behind his back, tightened until his knuckles went white. Because Kang Siahan was the one player who never stayed dead when the system said he should. He straightened. The mask slid back into place, perfect, polished, impenetrable. Activate the protocol. Target the anomaly player's data signature. And make sure it's done before he drops another relic. The room moved. Orders were transmitted. Encrypted commands were routed through the authority's deepest system access channels, channels that no ordinary administrator could reach. Channels that had been hardwired into Etheron's architecture by the Celestial Order themselves during the Reawakening Update's development phase. When they had leveraged their hero status to gain developer-level access to the game's core code. Protocol erasure began its activation sequence. And in a dungeon on the outskirts of Taejun, Kang Siahan paused mid-step. Not because he sensed danger. After centuries in the void, danger was as familiar as breathing. He paused because something in the system's ambient energy had shifted. A vibration beneath the code. A tension in the architecture, like a wire being pulled taut somewhere deep in the game's foundation. Something was being activated. Something big. Something aimed directly at him. He looked down at Yuna, who was practicing her third void technique repetition against a stone column, sweat dripping from her chin. Her system interface flickering with errors she had learned to ignore. "That's enough for today," he said. She looked up, surprised. He had never ended a session early before. "Why?" "I can still, because something is coming," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made her stop arguing instantly. "And I need you to be somewhere safe when it arrives." The air in the dungeon grew cold. Not from any monster. Not from any attack. From the system itself, which had begun to hum with a frequency that sounded, to anyone listening closely enough, almost like a countdown. Siahan looked toward the dungeon's exit, his eyes calm, his body still, his maxed-out stats coiled inside him like a compressed universe waiting to expand. They had built a weapon to erase him. He had spent centuries becoming something that couldn't be erased. The countdown continued. And Kang Siahan, the forgotten hero, the Void Walker, the era that exceeded all parameters, simply stood and waited, not with fear, not with anger, but with the quiet, patient certainty of a man who had already survived the worst thing the universe could throw at him, and knew that whatever came next was just another problem to solve. The throne was cracking. And the cracks were just getting started. The sky above Seoul cracked like shattered glass at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Not metaphorically. Not in some subtle, barely perceptible way that only high-level hunters would notice. The actual sky, the pale autumn blue that millions of people were going about their ordinary lives beneath, split apart with a sound so vast and so fundamentally wrong that every living creature within a 100-kilometer radius felt it in their bones before their ears even registered the noise. It was the sound of reality being torn at the seams, of dimensional fabric that was never meant to be stressed this way finally giving out under a pressure that had been building, invisibly. For exactly 10 years. Protocol erasure had been activated. To the public, it appeared as a system-wide event notification, the kind that Etheron, reawakening occasionally deployed for special raids or seasonal content updates. A massive translucent banner materialized across every player's interface simultaneously, pulsing with an urgency that felt almost festive, almost exciting. Special event, the Architect's Trial, all players above D rank are required to participate, mandatory dungeon instance loading, required. Not invited. Required. Across the world, thousands of hunters felt the pull, a forced teleportation protocol embedded so deep in the system's code that no logout command, no resistance skill, no emergency extraction tool could override it. In Seoul, in Tokyo, in New York, in London, in Sao Paulo, in every city where layered dungeon zones intersected with human civilization. Hunters were ripped from whatever they were doing and deposited into massive instanced arenas, digital kill zones designed to look like raid dungeons but functioning as something far more sinister. They were cages. Holding pens. And every single player trapped inside them was bait. Because protocol erasure wasn't a raid event. It was a targeted assassination tool disguised as one, a precision-guided deletion protocol designed to locate one specific data signature among the thousands of players caught in its net. Isolate that signature, and erase it from the system's architecture so completely that even the void wouldn't be able to spit it back out. The target, of course, was Kang Siahan. Deep beneath the World Gate Authority's headquarters, in a sub-basement that didn't appear on any official blueprint. Baek Ji-hun stood before a console that pulsed with lines of code so complex they looked like living organisms. The 11 other members of the Celestial Order's inner circle flanked him in a semicircle, their faces lit by the harsh blue glow of the protocol's operational display. Each of them had contributed a portion of their system authority to power the activation, a combined authorization that represented the highest level of access any player group had ever held in. Etheron's architecture. Signature located, Choi Sarah reported from her monitoring station, her fingers dancing across holographic keyboards. He's in the Taejun zone. The protocol is narrowing. Estimated time to full data lock, 90 seconds. Jihoon watched the display with eyes that held no triumph. No satisfaction. Only the hollow, mechanical focus of a man who had committed to a course of action and refused to contemplate its moral dimensions. Begin the erasure sequence the moment you have a lock, he said. And cut the broadcast feeds to the kill zones. I don't want the trapped players seeing anything they shouldn't. He paused, then added, almost to himself, end this. Once and for all. The protocol reached for Siahan like a digital hand closing around a throat. It found him in a dungeon corridor outside Taejun, exactly where the tracking data said he would be. The erasure code latched onto his data signature, his stats, his skills, his titles, his inventory. The very ones and zeros that defined his existence within the system, and began the deletion process. Line by line. Layer by layer. Pulling him apart the way you'd unravel a thread from a tapestry. For exactly 1.3 seconds, it worked. His outermost data layers, the surface-level stats that the system used for basic identification, began to dissolve. His character model flickered. His interface stuttered. And in that brief, breathless moment, every member of the Celestial Order watching the monitoring feeds allowed themselves to believe that it was over. That the ghost had finally been put to rest. That the sin they had committed a decade ago would remain buried forever. Then the system screamed. Not a metaphorical scream. Not an error chime or a warning tone. The system, Etheron's entire global architecture, every server, every node. Every line of code that governed the merged reality of game and Earth, produced a sound that transmitted through every connected interface on the planet. A sound that was equal parts digital distortion and something older, something almost organic, as if the system itself was a living thing and something had just tried to rip out its spine. Because that's effectively what Protocol Erasure had attempted to do. Kang Siahan hadn't just spent centuries in the void. He had become part of it. And when the void was overwritten during the reawakening update, his data, the impossibly complex, centuries-deep layers of stats, skills, titles, and experiences that defined his existence, had been woven into the new system's root architecture. Not as a player. Not as an entity the system recognized and managed. As a foundational element. A load-bearing pillar of the code itself. His data wasn't stored in the system. His data was the system. Or at least, a part of it so fundamental that removing it was equivalent to trying to delete the concept of gravity from the laws of physics. You could write the code to attempt it. You could execute the command. But reality itself would reject the operation, violently, catastrophically, and with consequences that no amount of planning could predict. The erasure code hit his root-level data and bounced. Not gently. Not with a simple error message and a failed operation log. It bounced with the force of an unstoppable process meeting an immovable architecture, and the energy of that collision had to go somewhere. It cascaded backward through the protocol's own pathways, overloading every system node it touched, burning through firewalls and safety protocols like acid through paper. The kill zone instances, the cages holding thousands of trapped players, destabilized instantly, their walls flickering and cracking as the energy surge tore through their code. And then the rifts opened. Not dungeon portals. Not controlled gate entries managed by the authorities' infrastructure. These were wounds, ragged, bleeding tears in the fabric of merged reality that split open above every major city on Earth simultaneously. Seoul. Tokyo. New York. London. Mumbai. Cairo. Sao Paulo. 17 cities. 17 rifts. Each one pulsing with the same corrupted, festering energy that Siahan had spent centuries fighting in the void. The architect's energy. The fragments of the final boss that the Celestial Order had left wounded and rotting between dimensions for a decade. The protocol's failed erasure attempt had done what 10 years of slow decay hadn't, it had blown the door wide open. And now every fractured piece of the cosmic entity that should have been destroyed in the throne of collapse was pouring through into the real world like infection from a wound that had never been cleaned. Chaos erupted. The architect's fragments weren't monsters in the traditional sense. They were pieces of a god, a cosmic intelligence that had been designed as Etheron's ultimate challenge. An entity so powerful that the system's original developers had built the entire endgame around the cooperative effort required to defeat it. Each fragment manifested differently, towering humanoid figures made of crystallized void energy, serpentine constructs that phased through buildings like ghosts. Swarms of geometric shapes that dismantled matter at the molecular level. But they all shared one characteristic: they were orders of magnitude more powerful than anything the current Hunter system was equipped to handle. In Seoul, an S-rank enforcement team, the Celestial Order's elite rapid response unit, engaged a fragment that had materialized above Gangnam. 6 of the authority's best hunters, armed with top-tier equipment and coordinated by years of training, launched a combined assault that represented the peak of what organized hunter combat could achieve. The fragment destroyed them in 4 seconds. Not killed. Destroyed. Their equipment shattered. Their skills nullified. Their stats inflated by stolen power from an incomplete raid, proving utterly insufficient against an enemy that was born from the very power they had failed to properly claim. The fragment didn't even change direction. It swatted them aside like insects and continued its path through the city, leaving a trail of crystallized destruction in its wake. Across the world, the same scene repeated. Hunter teams engaged fragments and were overwhelmed. Emergency barriers activated and were bypassed. Evacuation protocols initiated and collapsed under the sheer scale of the incursion. The World Gate Authority, the organization that had positioned itself as humanity's shield against dimensional threats, was revealed, in the space of minutes, to be exactly what it had always been beneath the polished surface: a house of cards built on stolen power and sustained by a lie. And then, in Seoul, something changed. The central rift, the largest one, hovering above the authority's own headquarters like a cosmic indictment, pulsed. The fragments in the area paused, their crystalline bodies turning in unison toward a single point on the ground below. Every system interface in the city flickered, then stabilized, then displayed a single notification that hadn't been generated by the authority's communication system. It had been generated by the game itself. System notice: original player detected, identity confirmed, player, Kang Se-han, status, active. The system recognizes IT's Architect's Bane. He walked out of a side street. No dramatic entrance. No flash of light or explosion of power. Just a man in simple clothes, stepping out from between 2 buildings and walking toward the central rift with the measured, unhurried pace of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. The street around him was chaos: civilians running, hunters retreating, fragments descending from the rift like falling stars of corrupted light, but Se-han moved through it all as if he existed in a different layer of reality, untouched by the pandemonium. His eyes fixed on the rift above with an expression that held no fear, no anger, no hesitation. Just quiet, centuries-old resolve. The system, acting on protocols so old they predated the reawakening update, protocols embedded in the original Etheron Online's core architecture, activated its global broadcast function. Every interface on the planet, every holographic display, every screen in every hunter base, every public terminal, every personal device connected to the system's network. All of them showed the same thing: a live feed of Kang Se-han walking toward the rift. The world watched. And Kang Se-han began to fight. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't activate a visible skill. He simply raised one hand as the first wave of architect fragments descended upon him, a dozen crystalline constructs, each one powerful enough to annihilate an S-rank team, and moved. What followed wasn't combat in any conventional sense. It was erasure. Each fragment that came within arm's reach of Se-han simply ceased to exist. Dismantled by strikes so precise and so fundamentally devastating that the system couldn't even calculate damage numbers, it just displayed, beyond measurement, in small, almost apologetic text before the fragment's data dissolved entirely. But the fragments didn't just die silently. As each one was destroyed, it released something: a burst of stored data, a memory, a recording encoded in the architect's fractured consciousness. And because the system's broadcast was active, because every interface on the planet was tuned to this moment, those memories played out for the entire world to see. The first fragment showed the throne of collapse. The original raid. 12 players turning on a 13th. A poisoned blade in the back. A whispered justification. The second fragment showed the aftermath. The Celestial Order emerging from the dungeon, rehearsing their story, coordinating their lies. Ji-hun coaching each member on what to say to the cameras, his face composed, his voice steady, his eyes completely empty. The third fragment showed the founding of the World Gate Authority. Backroom deals. Falsified credentials. A ranking system designed from inception not to measure strength fairly, but to ensure that no one could ever rise high enough to threaten the people at the top. The fourth fragment showed a B-rank hunter named Jin Yuna asking questions in a classified briefing room. Showed the looks exchanged between Celestial Order members when they realized he had accessed sealed raid data. Showed the dungeon accident that followed, 4 authority enforcers cornering a single man in a dungeon's lower floor, their weapons drawn, their orders clear. Across the world, billions of people watched a man they had never heard of die for the crime of seeking the truth. And in Taejun, in a safe house where Siahan had insisted she stay. Yuna watched her brother's murder play out on her interface with tears streaming silently down her face and her fists clenched so hard that her nails drew blood from her palms. She didn't look away. Not for a single second. Fragment after fragment fell. Memory after memory surfaced. The system didn't editorialize. It didn't add commentary or context. It simply showed the raw, unfiltered truth, data recovered from the architect's consciousness, from the void's memory, from the sealed archives that the Celestial Order had spent a decade burying. 10 years of lies. Exposed in 10 minutes of combat. And Siahan kept walking forward. Through the fragments. Through the memories. Through the wreckage of a betrayal that had cost him everything and given his betrayers the world. He moved toward the central rift with the same steady, implacable pace, and with every step, the rift's energy responded to his presence, not with hostility, but with recognition. The void knew him. The architect's essence knew him. He had spent centuries in their domain, fighting their manifestations, learning their patterns. Becoming so intertwined with their code that the boundary between player and system had dissolved entirely. He was almost at the rift's base when the ground in front of him exploded. Ji-hun descended from above like a falling meteor, and Siahan understood immediately that the man standing before him was no longer entirely human. The chairman of the World Gate Authority had used something, a relic, an artifact. Something hidden and forbidden that pulsed with the same corrupted energy as the fragments themselves, to absorb an architect fragment directly into his own body. The transformation was grotesque and magnificent in equal measure. Ji-hun's left side remained human, the polished face, the tailored suit, the carefully maintained image of a leader. His right side was something else entirely, crystalline void matter that had fused with his flesh, extending his arm into a massive blade of pure dimensional energy. Covering half his face in a mask of angular, glowing geometry. His stats had skyrocketed. The system display that flickered around him showed numbers that would have made any S-rank hunter on the planet weep with envy. For a brief, terrible moment, Baek Ji-hun was the most powerful player in the world. Second most powerful. You always had to be the special one, didn't you? Ji-hun's voice was distorted, half human, half something that resonated with frequencies the human throat wasn't designed to produce. He stood between Siahan and the rift, his transformed arm crackling with energy, his one visible eye burning with a fury that had been fermenting for a decade. The prodigy. The natural. The one the system loved more than anyone else. Do you have any idea what it was like standing next to you? Watching you break records without trying. Watching you solo content that took the rest of us weeks to clear as a team. He swung his crystalline arm, and the force of the blow split the street for 300 meters in either direction. Siahan sidestepped it, barely, deliberately, not because he needed to dodge but because he wanted to hear what Ji-hun had to say. Because after centuries of silence, after endless years of wondering why, the answer was finally standing in front of him, screaming itself raw. I was your best friend. Ji-hun roared, and beneath the distortion, beneath the monster he had made himself into, there was something that sounded horrifyingly like genuine pain. I stood beside you from the beginning. I fought with you, I bled with you, I believed in you more than anyone. And every single day, you pulled further ahead, and every single day, the gap between us grew wider, and I knew, that eventually you would leave us all behind. That we would become footnotes in your story. Supporting characters in the legend of Kang Siahan. Another swing. This one shattered a building. Siahan deflected it with his forearm, no skill, no technique, just raw stat superiority absorbing an attack that would have vaporized a city block. So I made a choice, Ji-hun continued, his voice dropping from a scream to something quieter and infinitely more terrible. I chose us over you. I chose 12 people who would always be overshadowed over one person who would always outshine everyone. Was it selfish? Yes. Was it wrong? He laughed, a broken, jagged sound. Of course it was wrong. I've known it was wrong every single day for 10 years. But I would rather be wrong and powerful than right and invisible. He charged. Full force. Every ounce of stolen power and absorbed architect energy compressed into a single, devastating assault aimed directly at the man who had once been his closest friend. The ground beneath him cratered. The air around him ignited. His system display showed a damage output number so high that the interface couldn't render it properly, the digits blurring and overlapping like the system itself was straining to contain the force. Siahan caught the blow with one hand. The shockwave leveled everything within a 200-meter radius, lampposts bent, windows shattered, parked vehicles flipped and tumbled like toys. But at the epicenter, where two forces met, there was perfect stillness. Siahan's fingers were wrapped around Ji-hun's crystalline blade, holding it motionless, and his eyes, ancient, tired, carrying the weight of centuries, met Ji-hun's one remaining human eye with an expression that Ji-hun had never seen before. Not anger. Not contempt. Not the cold satisfaction of a powerful man about to crush a weaker one. Sadness. You were never invisible to me, Siahan said quietly. You were the reason I kept pushing. Because I wanted to clear a path wide enough for all of us to walk through. Not just me. All of us. Ji-hun's eye widened. The crystalline half of his face flickered. And for one fractured moment, beneath the monster, beneath the chairman, beneath the decade of lies and stolen glory, Baek Ji-hun, the real one. The one who had once laughed beside a campfire in a low-ranked dungeon and called Siahan his brother, surfaced. And broke. Then why? His voice cracked. The distortion faded, leaving only a human sound. A small, devastated human sound. Why were you so far ahead that I couldn't even see your back anymore? Siahan didn't answer with words. He activated a skill. Not a void technique. Not a combat ability. Not any of the thousands of maxed-out offensive capabilities that the system couldn't even classify. He activated the one skill he had learned in the deepest, darkest, most isolated moment of his centuries in the void, a moment when he had been so alone, so broken. So consumed by the memory of betrayal that he had stood on the edge of simply letting the void take him. In that moment, the system had offered him a choice. A hidden quest with no reward screen, no experience points, no stat bonus. Just a question, displayed in text so faint he almost missed it. You have been betrayed by those you loved. You have suffered beyond measure. You have earned the right to carry this suffering forever, or to release it. What do you choose? He had chosen to release it. Not for them. For himself. The skill was called Mercy. It had no damage value. No attack animation. No critical hit chance. It couldn't be leveled up. It couldn't be enhanced. It existed outside the combat system entirely, a skill that could only be activated by someone who had endured ultimate betrayal and, at the moment of absolute power over their betrayer, chose not to become what had been done to them. The skill activated with no sound, no light, no visual effect that the billions of watching viewers could see. But its impact was absolute. Every stolen stat point in Ji-hun's body, every level gained from the incomplete raid's stolen rewards, every skill acquired through falsified credentials, every title earned through manufactured heroism, was identified, isolated, and removed. Not destroyed. Returned. Redistributed back into the system's general architecture, where the original raid had intended them to go. The architect fragment fused to his body rejected its host and dissolved. The crystalline armor shattered and fell away like broken ice. The monstrous blade crumbled to dust. And Baek Ji-hun, stripped of everything he had stolen, reduced to the stats he had actually earned through his own effort, collapsed to his knees as his system display flickered and updated. Player, Baek Ji-hun, Level 1, all previously held titles, revoked, status, active, Level 1. The same level as a player who had just created their character. The same level as the frightened teenagers in the starter zones who swung wooden swords at training dummies. But unlike those teenagers, Ji-hun carried the full, unshielded memory of everything he had done. Every lie. Every murder. Every moment of stolen glory. The skill didn't erase his mind. It didn't grant him the mercy of forgetting. It made him remember. All of it. Forever. He knelt on the shattered pavement, his body trembling, tears streaming down a face that the world had worshipped as a hero's for 10 years. Around the planet, billions of people watched the chairman of the World Gate Authority, the men who had claimed to save the world, weep on his knees at Level 1. His crimes laid bare by the very system he had tried to control. Siahan stood over him for a long moment. The rift above still pulsed. The remaining fragments still threatened other cities. There was work to do, so much work, the kind that couldn't be solved with maxed-out stats or void techniques. But for this one moment, he allowed himself to feel the weight of what had just happened. The closure of a wound that had been open for centuries. Get up, Ji-hun, he said finally. Not cruelly. Not gently. Just honestly. The way one person speaks to another when all the masks have finally fallen. You have a long way to climb. And this time, you're going to do it without stepping on anyone else. He turned away. Toward the rift. Toward the architect's remaining fragments. Toward a fight that had been waiting 10 years, and several centuries, to be finished properly. Behind him, Baek Ji-hun remained on his knees, Level 1, stripped bare, surrounded by the ruins of an empire built on betrayal. The void remembered everything. And now, so did the world. The reconstruction took 3 months. 3 months for the World Gate Authority's central headquarters to be evacuated, dismantled, and repurposed into something that actually resembled what its name had always claimed it was, an authority governing gates for the world's benefit, not a private empire built on stolen divinity. The 11 remaining members of the Celestial Order's inner circle were stripped of their positions, their fabricated titles revoked, their stats reduced to what they had actually earned before the betrayal. Some were prosecuted. Some vanished into obscurity. Some, a very small number, chose the harder path and began the long, grinding climb back from level 1, this time without shortcuts. This time carrying the weight of what they had done as the only baggage they were allowed to keep. Baek Ji-hun was among them. He was seen occasionally in E-rank dungeons, fighting goblins with rusted equipment and a face that no longer smiled for cameras, his every movement shadowed by hunters who recognized him and chose, day after day, whether to offer a hand or turn away. The world was still deciding what forgiveness looked like. So was he. But those 3 months of bureaucratic collapse and reconstruction were just noise in the background of something far more important. Because Kang Seahan had made an announcement. He did it without fanfare, without a press conference, without any of the theatrical staging that the old authority would have employed. He simply stood in the center of Seoul's main dungeon district, surrounded by hunters of every rank who had gathered after word spread that the men who had saved the world, the real one, not the fabricated version, was going to speak. The crowd was so large that the system had to create an overflow broadcast channel just to accommodate everyone trying to watch. Seahan looked out at the sea of faces, young and old, weak and strong, hopeful and skeptical, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet. Calm. The voice of a man who had spent centuries learning that power didn't need to shout to be heard. The final raid was never completed, he said. The Throne of Collapse. The Architect's Core. The original endgame that Etheron Online was designed around. It's still out there. Still waiting. Still unfinished. He paused, letting that sink in. And I'm going to clear it. Properly this time. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Several high-rank hunters exchanged glances, the kind of glances that said they were already calculating party compositions, optimal strategies, who would get the first clear achievements. Seahan raised a hand. The murmuring stopped. But I'm not doing it alone. And I'm not doing it with a hand-picked elite team. His eyes swept across the crowd, meeting gazes from S-rank guild leaders and F-rank beginners with exactly the same level of respect. The system was always designed to distribute the final raid's rewards equally among everyone who participated. Not the strongest. Not the fastest. Everyone. That was the original design. That's how it should have been 10 years ago. His voice hardened slightly. And that's how it's going to be now. He reached into his inventory, and every hunter watching, both in person and through broadcasts around the world, saw him pull out an item that made the system's interface flicker and strain just trying to render it properly. A key. Not metaphorical. An actual key, glowing with the same void-touched energy that had characterized every relic Seahan had left behind in his anonymous dungeon clears. But this one was different. Larger. More complex. Pulsing with a rhythm that felt almost alive. Item, Architect's Gate Key, Original System Artifact, Effect, grants access to the true final raid, Open Participation Mode enabled, Restriction, None. All players may enter regardless of rank. The raid opens in 72 hours, Seahan said. The entrance will appear in every major city simultaneously. Anyone can enter. Anyone can fight. And everyone who contributes, even if your contribution is a single hit point of damage, even if all you do is survive long enough to witness the clear, will receive an equal share of the completion rewards when the architect falls. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes thunder. And then the world exploded into motion. Guild halls erupted into frantic preparation. Public training dungeons were booked solid within minutes. Equipment markets crashed and surged as hunters of every rank scrambled to optimize their gear. The hunter forums, which had spent 3 months dissecting every detail of the Celestial Order's exposed corruption, pivoted overnight into strategy discussions, party composition theories, and survival guides for low-rank players who had never dreamed they'd be allowed into endgame content. Because this wasn't just a raid announcement. It was a revolution. For 10 years, power in the merged world had flowed upward, concentrated in the hands of the few, gated behind rank requirements and authority-controlled access permissions. The strong became stronger. The weak stayed weak. The ladder was designed to be climbed slowly, if at all, and only by those who played by the rules set by people who had cheated to reach the top. Siahan had just shattered the ladder entirely and replaced it with a door that anyone could walk through. Among those preparing was Yuna. She stood in a private training hall, one she could finally afford after rising to C rank through relentless, legitimate grinding over the past 3 months, and ran through her forms with a precision that would have been unthinkable half a year ago. Her movements carried the unmistakable signature of void techniques now, strikes that made the air shimmer and crack in ways that the system's monitoring tools couldn't quite track. She was still learning. Still growing. But the gap between the frightened F-rank girl who had nearly died in a beginner zone and the hunter she was becoming had been crossed through sweat, failure, and the kind of training that left her collapsed on dungeon floors more nights than she could count. But she had never stopped. Not once. Because every time exhaustion told her to quit, she thought of her brother. Of the way he had smiled when he told her that being strong wasn't about power, it was about standing up even when standing was impossible. And then she thought of Siahan, who had stood alone in the void for centuries and emerged not as a monster drunk on his own strength, but as someone who used that strength to open doors for others. She wanted to be that kind of strong. The raid entrance materialized exactly 72 hours after Siahan's announcement, and it was like nothing the world had ever seen. Not a dungeon gate. Not a portal. A threshold, a massive doorway carved from stone and void light that rose 300 meters into the sky above Seoul's central plaza. Its surface inscribed with writing in a language that predated the current system, text that pulsed and shifted as though alive. Identical thresholds appeared in Tokyo, New York, London, Mumbai, and every other major city simultaneously. And the players came. Hundreds of thousands of them. S-rank hunters in legendary equipment standing shoulder to shoulder with F-rank novices in leather armor they'd bought yesterday. Guild leaders coordinating with solo players. Veterans explaining mechanics to beginners who had never seen endgame content before. The system had to create layered instances just to handle the sheer number of participants, each instance a copy of the same raid. Each one connected so that progress in any instance contributed to the global clear percentage. It was cooperation on a scale the merged world had never witnessed. Not because anyone was forced, but because the system, finally allowed to function as it was originally designed, rewarded cooperation over competition. Yuna entered through the soul threshold. She had been invited to join 3 different guild parties. Her skill with void techniques had made her a valuable asset despite her relatively modest rank. She had declined all of them. Not out of arrogance, but because there was only one person she wanted to fight beside in this moment. She found Siahan waiting just inside the threshold, standing alone in a staging area that was rapidly filling with arriving players. He wore simple equipment, nothing legendary, nothing enhanced, just functional gear that looked almost identical to what a mid-rank hunter might use. But the air around him felt different. Heavier. As if reality itself recognized his presence and was being polite about it. "You came," he said when he saw her. "Of course I came," she replied. "You opened the door." "I'm walking through it." He smiled. It was a small thing, barely a shift in his expression, but it was the first time she had ever seen anything approaching warmth on his face. "Then let's finish this." The raid itself was everything the original Etheron Online's developers had envisioned when they designed the Throne of Collapse, a 12-phase encounter that required not just raw power but coordination, timing, adaptation, and the willingness to trust the players fighting beside you. The architect wasn't a monster to be overpowered. It was a test. A challenge designed to prove that humanity, fragmented, flawed, competitive, and chaos-prone, could come together when the stakes demanded it. Phase by phase, the raid progressed. Millions of players across hundreds of instances fought, died, respawned at checkpoints, and fought again. High-rank hunters learned to coordinate with low-rank players whose contribution might only be a single debuff or a well-timed distraction but whose presence mattered just as much. The system's damage meters didn't show individual rankings, they showed collective progress. Every hit point mattered. Every player mattered. And at the center of it all, leading the charge in the primary instance that millions watched through the system's broadcast function, Siahan and Yuna fought side by side. She had become extraordinary. Not through stolen power or shortcuts, but through the kind of growth that only came from someone who had been broken and chose to rebuild themselves stronger. Her void strikes hit with force that made S-rank hunters pause and reassess their assumptions about what C-rank meant. Her movement was fluid, efficient, beautiful, the product of training that had stripped away every wasted motion and left only necessity. When the architect's 10th phase transition nearly wiped the raid with a room-wide attack that ignored conventional defense, it was Yuna who activated a void technique that Siahan had taught her in their final training session, a technique called shared burden that distributed damage across all willing participants in range. She survived with 3 hit points. So did the 400 players near her who would have died otherwise. The system broadcast her name across every interface. Player Yuna, C rank, has prevented a raid wipe using an unknown defensive technique. She didn't see it. She was already moving toward the next phase, her brother's memory burning in her chest like a second heartbeat. The 12th and final phase began with the architect, no longer a fragmented entity but its true core. A being of geometric perfection and cosmic intelligence that hovered at the center of a dimension that existed outside normal space, speaking directly to Siahan. Its voice was everywhere and nowhere, a sound that bypassed ears and resonated directly in the minds of every player present. You were never trapped, Kong Siahan. You were forged. The raid froze. Every player stopped moving, confused, as the architect's presence focused entirely on the men who had spent centuries in the void. The system recognized the corruption. It recognized that the players chosen to complete this challenge had failed not in strength but in character. So it did what it was designed to do, it adapted. It found the one variable that could not be corrupted. The one player whose will could survive isolation, whose strength could endure eternity, whose heart could carry betrayal and not become what betrayed him. The architect's form shifted. And for a moment, it displayed something that might have been gratitude, if a cosmic intelligence could feel such a thing. You are the system's correction. Its answer to its own failure. And for that, you have earned a choice that no other player will ever be offered. 2 prompts appeared before Siahan, visible not just to him but broadcast to every watching player across the world. Option 1, become the new architect, ascend beyond humanity, govern the system for eternity, ensure it never fails again. Option 2. Return to level 1, restore the system to pure player governance, live as an ordinary person in the world you have saved. The first option glowed with power. The promise of absolute authority. The ability to prevent corruption, to guide the system, to ensure that what happened with the celestial order could never happen again. Immortality. Omniscience within the bounds of Etheron's architecture. Godhood, essentially, for someone who had already proven he could bear its weight. The second option was simple. Ordinary. Human. Siahan looked at the 2 choices for exactly 3 seconds. Then he smiled, genuinely, fully, with an expression of such profound relief that it made Yuna's chest tighten, and selected option 2 without a shred of hesitation. Choice confirmed, return to level 1, the architect acknowledges your decision, the system will belong to ITS players, as it always should have. The architect dissolved. Not in defeat. In completion. Its purpose fulfilled, its challenge answered not with power but with the wisdom to refuse power when it was no longer necessary. The raid clear notification blazed across every interface on the planet, and the rewards, stats, skills, titles. Items designed to elevate every participating player regardless of their starting rank, distributed exactly as the system's original code had intended. Equally. Fairly. Without exception. And Kong Siahan's level counter reset to 1. His stats zeroed. His maxed out skills vanished. His centuries of accumulated power dissolved like morning mist. The system stripped everything from him except one thing, a title that appeared in his profile, glowing faintly, permanent and unremovable. Title, the one who walked away. He logged out before anyone could stop him to ask questions, to offer him leadership positions, to beg him to reconsider. He simply closed his interface, selected the logout command that he hadn't used in what felt like several lifetimes, and allowed the system to release him back into the ordinary world. 2 weeks later, in a small cafe in Seoul's quieter district, the kind of place that didn't have holographic displays or hunter recruitment posters. Just warm lighting and the smell of coffee, Kong Siahan sat across from Yuna and listened to her complain. I'm telling you, the mechanics are broken, she insisted, gesturing with her cup emphatically enough that a bit of coffee sloshed onto the table. There's this B-rank dungeon in Busan, and the third boss has a phase transition that ignores void techniques entirely. I've tried 14 different approaches and I keep dying at 70%. Siahan. Wearing civilian clothes and looking exactly like an ordinary 22-year-old who had never spent centuries in a deleted server dimension, raised an eyebrow. Have you tried not using void techniques for that phase? She paused mid-rant. Blinked. Then groaned and dropped her forehead onto the table. I hate that you're right. He smiled into his coffee. Behind them, a news broadcast played on a small screen mounted near the cafe's counter, images of hunters from every rank working together in a newly discovered dungeon. The reporter excitedly explaining how the equal access system had led to unprecedented cooperation and a 30% increase in successful dungeon clears worldwide. The World Gate Authority, now genuinely governed by elected representatives from the hunter community rather than a shadow council of stolen power elites, had just announced new support programs for low-rank hunters. The world was healing. Slowly. Imperfectly. But genuinely. Yuna lifted her head and looked at him seriously. Do you ever regret it? Giving it all up? Siahan considered the question. He thought about the void. About the power. About the choice to walk away from godhood and return to being a person who could sit in a cafe and drink mediocre coffee with a friend who argued with him about dungeon mechanics. No, he said simply. I spent centuries being something other than human. I'm good with being ordinary for a while. She smiled. You're the worst ordinary person I've ever met. I'll take that as a compliment. They finished their coffee. Argued about the Busan dungeon for another 20 minutes. Made plans to try it together next week, Siahan as a level 1 support player, Yuna as the damage dealer. Both of them fully aware that she was now orders of magnitude stronger than him and neither of them caring even slightly. When Siahan finally returned home that evening and checked his player profile out of idle curiosity, he found that the system had added one more line to his status screen. Not something he could edit. Not something anyone else could see. Just a small note, written in the same ancient text that had covered the architect's threshold. Player, Kang Siahan, level 1, title, the one who walked away, status, offline, but never forgotten, and beneath that, in smaller text that flickered like a heartbeat, the system thanks you. Rest well, player. You've earned it. Siahan closed the interface. Smiled one more time, private, quiet, content. And for the first time in several centuries, he slept without dreaming of dungeons. The game was finished. The world was saved. And the greatest player who ever lived had chosen, in the end, to just be a person. Which was, perhaps, the strongest thing he had ever done.